Marcus Aurelius, a sleep story. There is a city built on 7 hills, a city of marble and shadow and the slow, ancient light of the Mediterranean afternoon, and in that city, in the year 121 in the Common Era, in a house on the Celian hill overlooking the rooftops and the temples and the long, silver thread of the Tiber winding through the valley below, a child was born who would become, in the fullness of quiet years and patient study, something that the world had not quite seen before and has not quite seen since, a philosopher who was also a ruler, a man who held the largest empire on earth in one hand and a private journal of moral reflection in the other, and who spent 40 years trying, with great seriousness and great humility, to do both of those things well. His name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came into the world in the deep spring of April, when the city of Rome was warm and fragrant and the hills were green and the Forum was full of the noise and movement of a civilization at what many considered to be the height of its power and its prosperity, the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, that long, cultivated, curious, traveling emperor who had built a wall in Britain and a villa at Tivoli and a pantheon in Rome with a circular hole in its dome through which the Roman sky fell in a perfect column of light onto the marble floor below, as if heaven and earth had agreed to meet at that precise point and nowhere else. The family into which Marcus was born was an old and respected one, a family of the senatorial class with roots in the Spanish province of Baetica, the same province that had produced the Emperor Trajan 2 generations earlier, and they were people of considerable culture and considerable seriousness, people who took their civic responsibilities with the gravity that Roman tradition demanded and who kept in their household the habits of reading and discussion and careful attention to conduct that distinguished the educated families of the period from those who had wealth without cultivation. His father, Marcus Annius Verus the elder, died when the boy was quite young, leaving him in the care of his mother Domitia Lucilla and his paternal grandfather, and both of these figures shaped him in ways that he would acknowledge throughout his life with warmth and with gratitude, the grandfather teaching him by the example of a long, patient, consistent life lived according to fixed principles, and the mother teaching him something harder to name, something about the quality of attention that a thoughtful person brings to the world, the habit of noticing and considering and not moving too quickly past the things that deserve to be understood. The house on the Celian hill was a comfortable, ordered place, a place of courtyards and colonnades and rooms full of books and the sound of water from the small fountains that Roman houses of that period built into their designs as naturally as they built walls and roofs, the sound of water being considered as much a part of a pleasant domestic life as the sound of conversation or of children at their lessons. The gardens were tended with care, the rooms were furnished with taste rather than extravagance, and the household ran according to a rhythm of meals and lessons and the visits of friends and relations and the various social obligations of a family of standing in the greatest city of the ancient world. The city of Rome outside the house was itself a kind of education, an education available simply through the act of moving through it with open eyes, the Forum with its temples and its basilicas and its crowded daily life visible from the hills above as a dense, active center of the civilization that the empire sustained. The processions and the markets and the legal hearings and the philosophical debates conducted outdoors in the spaces between the monuments, all of it available to a boy who walked the streets with his tutor on the long, warm Roman afternoons and who was old enough to begin understanding that the world was very large and very complicated and full of people whose lives were entirely different from his own and equally real for all that difference. He looked at all of it with the quiet, serious attention that was his most characteristic quality as a child, the attention that took things in and held them and turned them over slowly rather than consuming them quickly and moving on. Marcus was a quiet child, or so the accounts suggest, a child who preferred reading to games and who showed from an early age the quality of patient, persistent attention that would become the defining characteristic of his intellectual life. He was drawn to philosophy before he quite knew what philosophy was, drawn to the questions of how one ought to live and what one ought to value and how one ought to behave when circumstances were difficult or when other people were unkind or when the world did not arrange itself according to any principle that a person of goodwill could easily understand. These were not the questions of a child who had suffered greatly or been treated cruelly. They were the questions of a temperament, the natural orientation of a mind that was constitutionally inclined toward depth and seriousness, toward the long view rather than the immediate one, toward questions that could be lived with over a lifetime rather than answered quickly and set aside. He was noticed early. The Emperor Hadrian, who had an eye for promising young men and who enjoyed the cultivation of talent wherever he found it in the vast human garden of the empire, took an interest in the boy and gave him the nickname Verissimus, the most true, or the most genuine, a name that captures something real about the quality that distinguished him even as a child, the quality of sincerity, of meaning what he said and saying what he meant, of being the same person in every situation rather than presenting different faces to different audiences in the manner of the socially ambitious. Hadrian's attention was not without consequence. It placed Marcus at the center of the imperial world while he was still very young, in the corridors of power where the decisions were made that shaped the lives of millions of people across the enormous territory that Rome controlled, from the misty north of Britain to the burning south of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the eastern borders where Rome and Parthia faced each other across the disputed frontier. Hadrian, near the end of his life and childless, arranged for the adoption of a capable and reliable senator named Antoninus as his successor, and Antoninus was in his turn required to adopt 2 young men as his own heirs, one of whom was Marcus, then 17 years old, and this arrangement set the course of Marcus's life in a way that he had not chosen and that, by his own later account, he did not entirely welcome, because the life he wanted was a private life of philosophy and study and the company of thoughtful friends, not the public life of administration and ceremony and the responsibility for the welfare of an empire of 60 million souls. But he accepted what was required of him with the same patient, serious equanimity with which he would accept every other difficulty of his long life, because acceptance of what one cannot change was, for him, not merely a philosophical position but a daily practice, a discipline of the will and the attention that required constant renewal and constant effort. He was given to the household of Antoninus, who would be known to history as Antoninus Pius, and who proved to be one of the gentlest and most reasonable of all the Roman emperors, a man of serene temperament and unshakable patience who governed the empire for 23 years without leaving Rome, without fighting wars, without dramatic gestures of any kind, simply administering the vast machine of Roman government with steady, competent, unexcited attention, and whose example of patient, unassuming competence was itself one of the most important lessons of Marcus's education, the lesson that virtue does not require drama or display, that the good life is lived quietly and consistently in the ordinary circumstances of each ordinary day. The years of Marcus's education were long and rich and conducted at a pace that seems almost impossibly unhurried by the standards of any later age, years spent in the company of the finest teachers that Rome and the Empire could provide, teachers who were engaged by the emperor or by the boy's family to form his mind and his character according to the best understanding of the period of what an educated, virtuous man should know and be and do. He studied rhetoric with Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the greatest orator of the age, a Berber from North Africa who had come to Rome and made himself indispensable to the educated classes through the force of his intelligence and the quality of his Latin, and who loved his young student with something that went beyond professional pride, something genuinely warm and genuinely fond, evident in the letters they exchanged over many years. Letters full of mutual affection and shared jokes and the particular pleasure of two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company as well as each other's minds. He studied Greek literature and Greek philosophy, which for a Roman of the 2nd century was as natural as breathing, Greek being the language of culture and of serious thought in the way that Latin was the language of law and administration, and the two languages between them giving educated Romans access to the entire accumulated intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. From Homer to Plato to Aristotle to the historians and the tragedians and the lyric poets, all of it available to someone who had the patience and the dedication to work through it, and Marcus had both. But the teacher who mattered most to him, who shaped the direction of his intellectual life more profoundly than any other, was a man he never met in person, the philosopher Epictetus, a former slave from Phrygia in Asia Minor who had been freed by his master and who had established a school of Stoic philosophy in Nicopolis in Greece, where students came from across the Mediterranean world to hear him lecture on the nature of the good life, on the relationship between what we can control and what we cannot, on the importance of maintaining an ordered and tranquil inner life regardless of the disorder of outer circumstances. Epictetus had died a generation before Marcus was born, but his lectures had been recorded by one of his students, a man named Arrian, and the resulting work, known as the Discourses and the Enchiridion, found its way into Marcus's hands when he was in his teens, introduced by one of his teachers, a philosopher named Quintus Junius Rusticus, who had studied the Stoic tradition closely and who recognized in his young student a temperament that was naturally suited to its demands. The Stoic philosophy that Marcus absorbed through Epictetus and through Rusticus and through his own extensive reading had at its heart a simple and powerful distinction, the distinction between what is in our power and what is not. In our power, said the Stoics, are our own thoughts and intentions and judgments and desires, the inner life of the mind and the will. Not in our power is everything else, the actions of other people, the state of the world, the body's health or sickness, wealth and poverty, fame and obscurity, the 1,000 accidents and reversals that constitute the external surface of a human life. The wise person, the person who has understood this distinction and has ordered his inner life accordingly, achieves a kind of freedom that no external power can touch, because nothing that happens outside the self can reach the inner citadel of reason and judgment, and will that is the true self, the only self that matters. For Marcus, this philosophy was not an abstract intellectual position but a practical guide for living, a set of daily exercises and reminders and reorientations of attention that he practiced the way a musician practices scales, not because the scales are beautiful in themselves but because they build the technique that makes beauty possible. He rose in the mornings with the intention to think stoically, to begin the day by reminding himself of the principles that should guide it, and he returned in the evenings to examine how well he had managed to live by those principles in the actual circumstances of the day, which was, as he would have been the first to acknowledge, often imperfectly, because the gap between knowing how one ought to think and actually thinking that way in the press of events is wide and persistent, and the work of closing it is the work of a lifetime. He moved through his 20s in this combination of formal study and informal apprenticeship, learning the business of government by observing Antoninus at close range, accompanying the emperor through the routines of his administration, sitting in on the councils and the hearings and the vast administrative machinery that kept Rome and its provinces functioning, watching the older man's patient, unhurried management of the endless demands of governance with an attention that was not merely dutiful but genuinely interested, genuinely curious about how power worked and what it required of those who held it and what its proper uses were and what its limitations were and how a person of good conscience was supposed to navigate the daily reality of having authority over the lives of millions of people, most of whom you would never see and many of whom lived in conditions that your own life, however simple by the standards of the imperial court, could only dimly approximate. He was also a young man in the ordinary sense during these years, a person with friends and pleasures and the particular quality of life that belongs to someone in his 20s who knows that great responsibility awaits but has not yet had to carry it, who can still afford to give most of his attention to the things he most loves, the books and the philosophy and the long conversations and the particular pleasure of a mind that is genuinely exercising itself on questions that genuinely matter. He was engaged to a young woman named Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, and he loved her with a directness and a steadiness that were entirely characteristic of him, and when they were married, when he was 24 years old and she somewhat younger, the marriage was one of the genuine goods of his life, a source of warmth and companionship that endured through the decades of difficulty and campaigning and responsibility that followed. Faustina bore him many children, 13 or 14 by different accounts, though the cruelty of ancient infant mortality meant that many of them did not survive to adulthood, and the loss of children was one of the specific griefs of his life, a grief he bore with the stoic resignation that his philosophy demanded and that was at the same time a genuine and felt loss. Because Stoicism does not require the absence of feeling but only the refusal to be mastered by it, the maintenance of reason and judgment and clear sight in the presence of emotions that would, in a less disciplined person, overwhelm everything else. The Roman house in which the family lived, the haughty of his family and later the various imperial residences, followed the pattern of the great Roman domestic architecture of the period, organized around a series of courtyards and colonnades where air moved freely even in the hottest summer months, the walls thick and cool, the floors tiled in patterns of black and white and occasionally the warmer terracotta colors that the Italian earth provided, the rooms opening onto gardens where fountains ran and where the plants of the Italian garden, bay and rosemary and the dark, pointed forms of cypress trees, stood in their appointed places in the ordered landscape that the Romans made wherever they settled, a landscape that reflected their understanding of how the natural world ought to be arranged, how its energies ought to be organized and directed toward human purposes. In the evenings, after the day's work of study and observation and the social obligations of his position, Marcus would retire to his rooms and reading with the same systematic thoroughness that he brought to everything, working through the Stoic texts and the histories and the literature that Fronto had taught him to love, and sometimes writing, not for publication, not for any audience, but for himself, the private discipline of putting thoughts into words that would force him to clarify what he actually believed, to test his understanding against the resistance of language, to see which ideas were real and which were only approximately held. The years of Antoninus's reign were long and peaceful and prosperous by the standards of Roman history, and Marcus was in the privileged position of someone who could see that the system worked reasonably well when it was managed with competence and good faith, who could observe from close range the machinery of the greatest empire the world had yet produced operating more or less as intended, the courts delivering something that could be called justice, the provinces being administered with something that could be called fairness, the armies holding the frontiers with something that could be called reliability, and this long apprenticeship in functional governance shaped his understanding of what was possible and what was required in a way that pure theory never could have. He became emperor in March of 161, when Antoninus died at the age of 74 after a quiet, domestic illness, passing peacefully in his bed at the villa at Laurium outside Rome, leaving the empire in the most orderly possible state, as if he had arranged even his own departure with the same unexcited competence that had characterized everything else he had done. Marcus was 40 years old, which was not young by the standards of a century in which the average lifespan was considerably shorter than it would become in later times, and he was in many ways an already formed person when he took the throne, a person whose values and habits of thought were settled and whose character, for all the pressures that imperial power would bring to bear on it, would not fundamentally change. He did the unprecedented thing, unusual in the history of Roman emperors, of immediately sharing power with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, insisting on a co-emperor rather than ruling alone, an act that was so contrary to the self-preserving logic of autocratic power that it puzzled many of his contemporaries and has intrigued historians ever since. The most persuasive explanation is also the simplest, that he genuinely believed two capable rulers were better than one, that the responsibilities of empire were more than any single person ought to bear alone, and that the principle of shared governance was more important to him than the satisfactions of exclusive authority, and this explanation is persuasive because it is entirely consistent with everything else we know about him. His distrust of power as an end in itself, his belief that the purpose of a ruler's position was the welfare of those he governed rather than his own aggrandizement. The early months of the reign were occupied with the routines of imperial administration, with the endless flow of petitions and legal cases and administrative decisions that constituted the daily work of governing Rome, and Marcus approached this work with the same patient, unhurried attention that Antoninus had modeled, sitting in judgment for many hours each day, hearing cases with genuine care and genuine interest, taking the idea of justice seriously in a way that not all Roman emperors had managed to do, treating even the smallest petitioner as someone whose claim deserved real consideration and real thought rather than a quick dismissal or a formulaic response. He reformed aspects of the law in ways that were, by the standards of the age, genuinely humane, strengthening the rights of slaves to appeal against cruel masters, improving the legal standing of orphans and of women in matters of inheritance and guardianship, tightening the rules around the arbitrary exercise of power by local magistrates in the provinces. Small changes that individually might seem modest but that collectively represented a sustained effort to make the formal structures of Roman law correspond more closely to the Stoic principle that all human beings possessed the same fundamental dignity and the same fundamental claim to fair treatment. He spent the mornings of those early years of reign in the business of government, reading and responding to the correspondence that came from every corner of the empire, from governors seeking guidance on difficult cases, from military commanders requesting supplies and reinforcements, from local senates in the provincial cities seeking imperial permission for building projects or legal rulings or the resolution of long-running disputes that had exhausted every local mechanism available to settle them. The correspondence was vast and constant, requiring a mind that could move rapidly between very different kinds of problems and bring to each the same quality of calm, careful judgment, and Marcus seems to have managed this with a patience and a thoroughness that struck his contemporaries as remarkable, as something more than merely competent administration but rather an expression of a genuinely philosophical commitment to taking the claims of others seriously. The afternoons were sometimes given to less formal business, to the conversations with philosophers and writers and the various learned people who were drawn to the imperial court by the knowledge that the emperor was genuinely interested in intellectual life and would engage in real discussion rather than merely listening to performances of erudition staged for his benefit. He continued his philosophical reading and his philosophical writing throughout these years, the private journal that was his primary means of intellectual self-examination accumulating slowly and privately, never intended for anyone else's eyes, a running conversation between the present self and the better self that the philosophy was always asking him to become. Rome in the 2nd century was a city of enormous and bewildering variety, a city of perhaps 1 million people drawn from every part of the known world, every language and every religion and every social condition present in its streets and its neighborhoods. From the marble splendors of the Palatine Hill where the imperial residences stood to the crowded tenements of the Subura Valley where the urban poor lived 6 or 7 floors above the street in wooden buildings that swayed in heavy winds and caught fire with alarming regularity. He moved through this city in the formal processions and public appearances that imperial life required, and he observed it with the attention of a philosopher who had thought carefully about what a city was and what it required of those who inhabited it and those who governed it, the obligations that the social life of a complex and diverse human community placed on every individual within it but most particularly on those who held authority. He walked sometimes in the gardens of the various imperial properties, the haughty that had accumulated over generations of imperial acquisition, gardens that were among the most beautiful in the ancient world, vast and varied and full of the art and the horticulture of a civilization at its most cultivated. The marble statues standing among the shaped topiary and the reflecting pools and the long allays of trees that the Roman garden style favored, everything arranged with a precision and a care that was itself a kind of philosophy, the philosophy of bringing order and beauty to the natural world by understanding and working with its principles rather than against them. And then, in the 2nd year of his reign, before the administration of the empire had settled into any comfortable routine, the frontier broke, and the world Marcus had inherited proved to be considerably less stable and less peaceful than the long tranquility of Antoninus's reign had led anyone to expect. In the east, the Parthian king launched an invasion into the Roman provinces of Armenia and Syria, pushing the Roman frontier forces back and threatening the stability of the entire Eastern Empire, and in the north, along the long, cold, forested line of the Danube River that marked the northern boundary of Roman civilization, the Germanic tribes began to press against the frontier with a persistence and a force that had not been seen for generations. He sent Lucius Verus east to command the response to the Parthian threat, a campaign that lasted several years and that was eventually successful. The Parthians pushed back and the eastern frontier restored to something approaching its previous stability, though at the cost of a plague, the Antonine Plague, as it came to be known, that the returning soldiers brought back with them from the east. A disease that spread across the empire with the speed and the impartiality of all plagues, moving along the trade routes and the military roads from one city to the next, killing perhaps 5 million people over the decade of its worst prevalence, a catastrophe of a scale that had no parallel in the memory of the age. The plague was one of the great griefs and one of the great practical challenges of Marcus's reign, a challenge that combined the administrative difficulty of managing the economic disruption it caused with the philosophical difficulty of maintaining equanimity in the presence of a mortality so vast and so indiscriminate that it seemed to challenge the very idea of a rational, ordered cosmos that Stoic philosophy maintained. He met the administrative challenge with the practical competence and the genuine concern for his subjects that characterized everything he did in his public role, diverting resources to the worst affected areas, appointing officials to manage the crisis, trying to ensure that the machinery of government continued to function despite the losses it was suffering. He met the philosophical challenge, as always, in the pages of his private journal, working through the Stoic arguments for acceptance of what cannot be changed, reminding himself of the principles that should govern the response to calamity: reason, duty, compassion, the maintenance of the rational mind in the presence of overwhelming disorder. The northern frontier was the long preoccupation of the second half of his reign, the challenge that would eventually take him away from Rome for years at a time and that would find him in places entirely unlike anything his childhood and education had prepared him for: the cold, wet, forested lands beyond the Danube where the Germanic and Sarmatian tribes had been building the strength and the organization to challenge the empire's northern boundary in a sustained and serious way. The Marcomannic Wars, as these campaigns came to be known, began in earnest in 167 and continued, with periods of relative quiet between the major engagements, for most of the remaining years of his life, becoming the dominant experience of his later career and the context in which he wrote the most sustained and the most profound passages of his private meditations. He prepared for the northern campaign with the same thorough attention to practical detail that he brought to everything, organizing the logistics of moving and supplying an army through difficult country, recruiting soldiers to replace those lost to the plague and to years of frontier fighting, consulting with his military commanders about the terrain and the enemy's tactics and the best ways to conduct operations in the forests and the marshes of the region beyond the Danube that Rome had never quite managed to incorporate and had never quite been able to leave alone. He was not a military man by training or by temperament, and he knew it, and he managed this knowledge with the same honesty that characterized his self-knowledge in every other domain, acknowledging his limitations and compensating for them by relying heavily on the advice of experienced generals while retaining for himself the role of ultimate decision-maker and of the person responsible for ensuring that the campaign was conducted according to the principles of justice, of restraint, of respect for non-combatants where possible, that he believed should govern even the most necessary uses of force. He crossed the Danube for the first time in the spring of 168, moving north with the army into the country of the Marcomanni and the Quadi, the Germanic tribes whose pressure on the Roman frontier had made the campaign necessary. And the experience of that crossing was a threshold of a particular kind, the moment when the long years of education and preparation and administration in Rome became something else, something more immediate and more physical and more morally challenging than anything the city had required of him, the moment when the philosopher-emperor became, by necessity, a general in the field. The landscape of the northern frontier was utterly unlike anything Marcus had grown up among. The Mediterranean world he had always known was a world of sun and stone and the clean, dry clarity of winter light over marble and cypress and the long, silver-green groves of olive trees running up the hillsides of Italy and Greece and Spain and North Africa, a world whose beauty was composed of precision and warmth and the sense that the natural and the human had reached a long accommodation with each other, each shaping and being shaped by the other over millennia. The country beyond the Danube was something entirely different, vast, dark, wet, cold, the great forests closing in on every side with a density and a scale that had no parallel in the Roman experience, the trees enormous and ancient and indifferent, the paths through them muddy and uncertain, the sky visible only in narrow strips above the canopy, grey and low and full of the particular kind of northern cloud that does not pass quickly but settles in for days at a time, draining the color from everything below it. He established his headquarters at Carnuntum, on the southern bank of the Danube in what is now Austria, a military camp that in the years of his campaigns gradually acquired the character of a more permanent settlement, with the administrative buildings and the libraries and the workshops that any organized Roman military operation required, and that became for long stretches of time his primary residence, the place he returned to between the movements of the campaign, the place where he slept and ate and held his councils and wrote in his journal in the evening hours when the day's military and administrative business was done. The tent or the room in the camp at Carnuntum or in one of the other frontier posts where the campaigns took him was a simpler space than any he had occupied in Rome, a space defined by function rather than comfort, containing what was needed and nothing more, a bed, a table, a lamp, the books and writing materials that were as necessary to him as food and sleep, the small philosophical library that traveled with him on campaign, battered and worn from the road, the papyrus rolls of Epictetus, and the other Stoic writers that he returned to in the evenings the way a devout person returns to a sacred text, not for the novelty of what they contained but for the renewal that the familiar words provided, the regrounding in principles that the day's events had tested and that needed, every evening, to be affirmed again. It was in these evenings, in the lamplit quiet of the frontier camp with the sounds of the army settling for the night outside the tent walls and the cold of the Danube valley working through the canvas, that he wrote what would eventually be known as the Meditations, a title given to the work long after his death, since he gave it no title himself and clearly had no intention of publishing it, a series of private notes to himself, reminders and reflections and arguments and admonishments and occasional expressions of gratitude, all of them addressed not to any reader but to himself, to the version of himself that forgot, in the press of events, what he actually believed, the version that needed to be recalled to the principles he was always trying to live by. The Meditations are written in Greek, which was for Marcus the natural language of philosophy, the language in which he had learned to think seriously and in which serious thinking had been done for the 5 centuries since Socrates had walked the streets of Athens asking his uncomfortable questions. They are written in a style that is entirely without literary vanity, without the careful elaboration of someone who is thinking about how the writing will be received, because the writing was not intended to be received by anyone, was intended only to serve the function of clarification and reminder that a person who is trying to live philosophically needs his private writing to serve the function of making explicit what is only implicit in the mind, of testing the coherence of beliefs by submitting them to the discipline of articulation, of holding oneself accountable by writing down what one is accountable for. What the meditations contain, in their quiet and unassuming way, is a sustained meditation on several interlocking themes that together constitute Marcus's understanding of what a good human life requires. The theme of impermanence is everywhere in the book, the impermanence of fame and power and the opinions of others and even of the self that is doing the thinking, the way that everything passes and nothing endures, the way that the great men of history have been forgotten and the great events of history have dissolved into the general blur of time, and the way that this recognition, properly understood, should not depress but liberate, should free the person who really grasps it from the tyranny of caring too much about things that will not last. The theme of the present moment recurs with the insistence of a philosophical refrain, the present moment as the only place where life actually happens, the only place where action is possible and where the will has its actual exercise, the past being gone beyond the reach of any action and the future being not yet arrived and therefore equally beyond reach, so that the whole of a human life, properly understood, is nothing but a series of present moments, each of which offers the same invitation to act well, to think clearly, to treat others with justice and with kindness, to do what duty requires without complaint and without self-pity. The theme of the rational nature shared by all human beings runs through the book as a kind of ethical foundation, the belief, central to Stoic philosophy, that reason is not the private property of any individual or any class or any people but the common inheritance of the human species, the thing that connects each person to every other person in a community of rational beings that is, in principle, universal, the basis for Marcus's insistence on treating even the most irritating and most difficult of his contemporaries with patience and with the recognition that they, like him, were doing their best with the understanding they had, that their failures of reason or of virtue were not so different in kind from his own failures, only different in the specific ways they manifested. He walked the camp in the early mornings, in the hour before the day's business began, when the army was waking and the fires were being lit and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the frost-stiffened ground. And these walks were his equivalent of the solitary walks in the fields around Zundert that shaped another philosopher of a later age, walks whose purpose was not exercise but recollection, the gathering of the mind's attention before the day scattered it in every direction. He would move through the orderly rows of tents, sometimes stopping to speak to the soldiers he encountered, the conversations brief and practical but not impersonal, not the automatic exchanges of a commander going through the motions of concern for the troops but the genuine interest of someone who believed, as a matter of philosophical principle, that every person he encountered deserved his genuine attention. The Danube in the mornings of those campaign years was a wide, dark, impressive river, moving with the slow authority of a great watercourse that knows exactly where it is going and has been going there for longer than memory, its surface gray or green or brown depending on the season and the weather, carrying on its current the materials of the northern world, fallen branches, the occasional upturned boat, the debris of the settlements along its banks, down toward the Black Sea with an indifference to the human dramas being enacted on its shores that Marcus found, in its own way, philosophically instructive. The river did not care about the Marcomannic Wars. The river did not care about the Roman Empire. The river simply flowed, doing what rivers do, and would continue to do so long after the empire had declined into the history books and the names of the emperors had become the province of scholars. He conducted the campaigns of those years with a consistent preference for negotiated solutions over military ones wherever negotiation was possible, offering terms to the Germanic tribes that were firm about the requirements of Roman security while recognizing the legitimate interests of the people on the other side of the frontier, the people who were, after all, also human beings possessed of the same rational nature that the Stoic philosophy attributed to all human beings everywhere, who had their own understanding of justice and their own claims upon the world that could not simply be dismissed because they were not Roman. This preference for diplomacy over force was not weakness and not naivety. He understood perfectly well that the tribes needed to understand the military consequences of continued incursion, but it was a genuine inclination, consistent with a philosophy that located the ultimate value of human life not in the outcome of particular conflicts but in the quality of the rational and moral agency that every human being possessed. The winters on the Danube frontier were long and cold and grey, the sky pressing down on the flat, frozen land with an implacable weight that had no parallel in the Mediterranean world of Marcus's upbringing, and the army hunkered in its winter quarters along the river with the patient endurance that long-service soldiers develop, the cooking fires burning low against the chill, the sounds of the camp muffled by snow, the days short and the nights long, and the work of maintaining discipline and morale and readiness in a large force of men who were far from home, a constant and unrelenting demand on the commanders at every level. He used the winter months for administration and for reflection, the pace of military operations necessarily slowing and the space that this created being filled with the correspondence of empire, the letters from Rome and from the provinces that required his attention and his decision, the petitions and the legal cases that had been accumulating during the campaign season and that needed resolution, the business of governing 60 million people that did not pause because the emperor was on the frontier, but that followed him there through the long chains of couriers and messengers that connected every part of the empire to the center where power resided. He also wrote, in the evenings, in the quiet of the campaign quarters, the notes and reflections that accumulated over the years into the body of work we know as the Meditations. The writing had a particular quality in those northern settings, a quality of hard-won equanimity, of principles maintained against the pressure of circumstances that made them genuinely difficult to maintain. Not the equanimity of someone who has never been tested, but the equanimity of someone who is being tested constantly and who chooses, every day, to try to meet the test with reason and patience and the particular kind of courage that philosophical living requires, the courage to keep thinking clearly when clarity is difficult, to keep caring about the right things when the wrong things are clamoring loudly for attention. He returned to Rome in the intervals between the campaigns, and the returns to the city were among the pleasures of those long years on the frontier, the warmth of the Italian climate after the cold of the Danube Valley, the familiar sounds and smells of the city, the company of Faustina and the children who had survived, and the friends and the philosophers and the various people whose conversation he valued and missed during the long months of campaign. He moved through the city in those intervals with the particular gratitude of someone who has been away long enough to see clearly what is valuable about what he has returned to, the beauty of the Italian light on marble and stone, the sound of the fountains in the gardens, the pleasure of a conversation conducted in leisurely comfort rather than in the enforced brevity of a military camp. He held philosophical conversations with the teachers and thinkers who came to the imperial court, continuing the practice of his whole adult life of taking philosophy seriously as something to be lived rather than merely discussed, something that should show in the actual quality of the decisions he made and the way he treated the people he encountered. Not as an intellectual hobby or a conversational decoration, but as the fundamental orientation of a life. He had little patience for philosophy that was only performance, for the elaborate display of philosophical knowledge that did not connect to any actual practice of living differently and better, and he said as much in the Meditations, reminding himself repeatedly that the measure of philosophical understanding was not the fluency with which it could be articulated, but the degree to which it was actually practiced, the degree to which the person who claimed to believe these things actually lived as though they were true. Faustina died in the winter of 175, in the eastern provinces, where she had accompanied Marcus during a period of crisis and campaign in that part of the empire, and her death was one of the great losses of his life, a loss that the Stoic practice of equanimity was required to bear, but that was not made nothing by that bearing. That was still a real loss. The loss of the person who had been closest to him through all the difficult years, who had known him in the private capacity that public figures are rarely fully known, who had been the warmth and the continuity of the household through all the disruptions that imperial life had imposed on both of them. He mourned her with the quiet, contained grief of a Stoic who knows that grief is appropriate and is not ashamed of it, but who also knows that grief should not master the person who feels it, should not become the organizing principle of the life that continues. He continued to govern, continued to campaign, continued to write in the evenings in the lamplit quiet of the frontier quarters. The Meditations accumulated slowly, not systematically but associatively, one thought suggesting another, one reminder generating the need for a complementary reminder, the whole thing gradually acquiring the character of a sustained conversation between the Emperor Marcus and the philosopher Marcus, between the man who had to make difficult decisions in difficult circumstances and the man who had studied for 40 years how to make decisions wisely and justly and in accordance with reason. A conversation that was always, at its heart, the same conversation: am I living as I believe I should live? And if not, why not? And what can I do to come closer to it? He took as a co-emperor in his later years his son Commodus, whom he formally elevated to the status of Augustus in 177, a decision that has puzzled and troubled historians ever since, because Commodus would prove to be one of the most disastrous emperors in Roman history. A man whose vanity and cruelty and self-indulgence were so extreme that even the Roman capacity for accepting the excesses of imperial power was eventually exhausted. It is not clear how much of this Marcus foresaw, or whether he foresaw any of it. The records suggest that Commodus was difficult and self-willed from his youth, and that Marcus was not unaware of his son's limitations, but also that the Stoic belief in the educability of human beings, the conviction that even an imperfect person could be brought to better understanding and better behavior through the right guidance and the right environment, may have led him to overestimate what that education could achieve. What is clear is that the decision to elevate Commodus, whatever its motivations and whatever its consequences, was the last major decision of Marcus's public career, because the years remaining to him after that elevation were few and were spent largely on the Danube frontier, in the military campaigns that would continue until the last months of his life, never quite concluding, never resolving into the lasting peace along the northern boundary that he had been working toward for more than a decade. He died at Vindobona, the Roman fort on the Danube that stands where the city of Vienna stands today, in the month of March in the year 180, 60 years after he had been born in the spring warmth of Rome, and he died in the manner of a Stoic philosopher and a Roman emperor, having conducted himself through the difficult business of his last days with the same patient, uncomplaining seriousness that had characterized his whole life, giving instructions for the continuation of the campaign and the administration of the empire, and then releasing, with appropriate philosophical composure, his hold on all of it. The Danube outside the camp walls would have been still icebound in March, the river dark and cold and full of the residue of the winter, and the sky above the frontier would have been that characteristic northern grey that he had spent so many years looking at and thinking under, so different from the Mediterranean blue of his childhood, and yet not, by the end, unfamiliar. Not a foreign sky, but the sky he had lived beneath for the better part of the last 15 years, the sky of his most serious work and his most serious thinking, the sky under which the meditations had been written in their quiet, private, unimaginable way. He left behind him the meditations, which he had never intended to publish, which were not discovered and circulated until after his death, and which have been read and carried and argued over and taken comfort from and argued with for nearly 2,000 years since, one of the most remarkable documents in the history of human self-examination. Remarkable not for its originality or its system or its place in the formal history of philosophy, but for its quality of genuine, unperformed, unguarded honesty, for the way it reads as the actual record of an actual person actually trying to live well, actually wrestling with the distance between his principles and his practice, actually failing sometimes and noticing the failure and trying again the next day. The questions he was asking himself in the evenings of those frontier years are not questions that belong to the second century in any limiting sense, are not questions whose answers depend on the particular circumstances of Roman imperial life in the age of the Antonines, are not questions that have dated with the specific historical conditions in which they were asked. They are questions that belong to any human being who has ever tried to maintain the quality of their inner life in the presence of external demands that would simplify and narrow and ultimately diminish it. The question of how to stay genuinely attentive in a life full of distraction, how to stay genuinely principled in a life full of compromise, how to stay genuinely kind in a life full of people who make kindness difficult, how to remain, in the deepest and most private sense, the person you actually are rather than the person that the pressure of circumstances is always trying to make you into. He asked these questions every evening, in a tent or a room on the edge of the known world, by the light of an oil lamp that cast its small, warm circle into the darkness around it, in a language he loved, the Greek of the philosophers, in a hand that was probably tired from the day's writing and the day's work, addressing himself with a directness and a candor that is possible only when one is certain of one's audience, certain that no one else is reading, writing the truth as clearly as one can manage it, without performance and without self-pity, and returning the next morning to the day's work with whatever additional clarity the night's writing had provided. This was his practice, and it was, in its quiet and unassuming way, one of the most extraordinary practices in the long history of human beings trying to understand themselves and to live well. Not the practice of a saint or a sage who had transcended ordinary human difficulty, not the practice of someone who had found a permanent solution to the problems of living with himself and with others and with the world, but the practice of someone who had found a way to keep working on those problems every day without losing heart, to keep the inquiry open, to keep the standards high without becoming rigid, to keep moving in the direction of reason and virtue and justice and compassion while acknowledging honestly and without self-deception that the movement was always imperfect and the destination was always beyond full reach. Allow that quiet to settle in around you now, the quiet of the frontier camp in the deep of the evening, after the day's difficult work is done and the army is still and the lamp has burned low and the writing is finished for the night and there is nothing left to do but rest. The Danube moved outside in the dark, carrying its cold, steady, indifferent river life toward the sea. The stars above the Danube valley are the same stars that were above Rome when he was a boy, the same stars that are above every point on the surface of the earth tonight, enormous and innumerable and entirely unconcerned with the small, warm, flickering business of human lives being conducted in the darkness below them. Let the mind rest now in that vast, indifferent, beautiful stillness, in the understanding that the day is done and that what was done today was done as well as it could be done, that no further effort is required tonight, that the body which has carried you through this day deserves its rest and the mind which has been attentive through this day deserves its quiet. There is nothing that needs to be solved tonight. There is nothing that needs to be understood tonight. There is only the darkness and the warmth of being alive in it, and the stars moving their slow, steady, ancient paths above the sleeping world, and the river finding its way to the sea, and the breath moving in and out without effort, without intention, simply happening, as breathing happens, as rivers flow, as stars move, as time passes, as everything that is alive continues its quiet and irreplaceable business of being alive. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in one of the quietest and truest sentences of the Meditations, that it is not death that a person should fear, but the failure to begin living. He had begun. He had continued. He had maintained his beginning, every day, against every difficulty, with every tool available to him, with philosophy and with practice and with the daily discipline of writing to himself in the evenings to remember what he believed and what it asked of him. He had done this for 40 years, in a palace and on a frontier, in prosperity and in plague, in peace and in war, in the warmth of Italy and in the cold of the Danube winter, and the record of the doing is there in those small, private, remarkable pages, available to anyone who reaches for it, offering not comfort in the conventional sense but something better, the company of a serious mind engaged in serious work, the company of someone who was genuinely trying to figure out how to live and who left behind the record of that effort as openly and as honestly as if he were simply leaving a lamp burning in the window, so that anyone who came after him through the same dark could find their way by its small, steady, reliable light. Let that light rest gently in the mind now. Let the frontier quiet settle over everything. Let the river move in its steady way. Let the stars do their ancient, patient work above the sleeping world. Let the breath find its own rhythm, slow and regular and easy, the way the Danube finds the sea, without effort and without hurry, simply following the nature of the thing, which is to move, and to keep moving, gently and without struggle, through the long and beautiful dark, toward morning. The lamp is low now. The writing is done. The day is finished and the night is full and the world is resting, every part of it, from the 7 hills of Rome to the wide, cold river at the edge of the known world, resting in the way that the world rests when the work is done and the thinking is quiet, and the only thing left to do is surrender, gently and without resistance, to the deep and dreamless dark that holds all sleeping things with the same vast, indifferent, absolute tenderness, and keeps them safe until morning comes again, as morning always comes, bringing with it the new light and the new day, and the same invitation that every day extends to every person who opens their eyes to receive it, the invitation to begin again, to try again, to live once more, as well as one can manage. Rest now. The emperor is sleeping. The philosopher is sleeping. The river runs. The stars turn. The world is at peace in its darkness, and you are part of that peace, and there is nothing more to do tonight, and nothing more to think, and all is well, and all is still, and the night is very deep and very quiet and very kind.